Picture this. You're standing right on the edge of a vast, shadowed valley. The air is thick, the path forward is completely obscured, and you know with absolute certainty that on the other side of this valley stands a force far greater than yourself, an insurmountable obstacle. Today, we're immersing ourselves in one of the most powerful, triumphant, and yet deeply tender chapters of historical text, Deuteronomy chapter 3. Through the lens of this ancient account, we're going to unpack what it really takes to face overwhelming odds, and how the lessons learned by the Israelites thousands of years ago actually hold the exact blueprint we need for the valleys we find ourselves walking through today. So, what do you do when the giant standing right in front of you seems completely, utterly impossible to defeat? We all face them. Your giant might not be an ancient king with a massive army. For a lot of us, the giants we wake up to look like sudden health challenges that completely turn our world upside down. They look like crushing financial burdens, broken relationships, profound loneliness, anxiety, or just an incredibly uncertain future. These giants appear incredibly large, and they are deeply threatening. They block our path and tell us there is simply no way forward. But as we'll see in our source material today, the size of the giant is never the final word. Section 1. Facing the impossible giants. Okay, let's dive into this. After defeating King Sihon, the Israelites turn north toward Bashan, and there they encounter King Og. Now, historically speaking, this guy's fascinating. King Og wasn't just another monarch. He was the last of the Rephaim, a people literally known for their extraordinary size and terrifying strength. His kingdom was filled with 60 fortified cities boasting high walls, gates, and iron bars. Honestly, just his reputation alone would have been enough to paralyze most armies with fear. The text gives us a very specific, mind-boggling detail to really help us visualize this threat, the number 9. King Og's bedstead, made of solid iron, was a massive 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. To put that into perspective, according to the standard cubit, that is over 13 feet long. Israel wasn't just facing a political adversary. They were facing a physical anomaly, a literal giant who ruled an impenetrable fortress. Humanly speaking, it was a complete mismatch. Yet look at what happens when God is in the equation. There's a really compelling story of a pastor who shared an anecdote about a faithful church member. This man unexpectedly lost his job of many years. He was absolutely devastated. Bills piled up, fear set in, and opportunities were completely scarce. It was a giant, plain and simple. But instead of giving in to that paralyzing fear, he committed to daily prayer and trust. Months later, doors suddenly opened to a new position with better income, more family time, and a much greater ability to help others. Looking back at that terrifying obstacle, the man said, "The giant that frightened me became the pathway God used to bless me." In the same way, Israel's terrifying giant, King Og, was utterly defeated, and his massive kingdom became a permanent testimony to God's greatness, a perfect opportunity for God to display his faithfulness. Section 2. The Promise Before Victory. You see, before Israel ever draws a single sword or marches on Bashan, God speaks to Moses. God says, "Do not fear him, for I have delivered him and all his people and his land into your hand." Did you catch the tense there? I have delivered him. It's past tense. God's promise came before the battle even began. Israel still had to march, right? They still had to physically fight. They still had to trust. But God had already determined the outcome in advance. And this brilliantly illustrates a pattern we see woven all throughout the historical and spiritual text. God prepares the victory in advance. Before young David ever stood on the battlefield to face Goliath, God had already prepared the victory. Before Joshua marched his people around the impenetrable walls of Jericho, God had already given the city into his hands. Before Daniel was thrown into a den of hungry lions, God had already prepared his protection. The battles are always real, for sure, and the fear is always visceral, but God's power is always greater. Section 3. Sharing the spiritual burden. So the giants are defeated, and the massive territory of Bashan and Gilead is fully conquered. Moses then distributes this newly conquered, incredibly fertile land to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. They get their inheritance, they are settled. But there is a very specific, non-negotiable condition attached to this massive blessing. The condition was this: blessed to bless. Even though these tribes had received their land, their fighting men were commanded to leave their wives, children, and livestock in these new fortified cities, cross over the Jordan River armed, and help their fellow Israelites fight their battles to conquer the rest of the land. They couldn't just sit back and enjoy their comfort. This reveals such a beautiful, profound principle of spiritual unity. God never intends for his people to live only for themselves. If you found stability, provision, or spiritual growth, that kingdom resource is meant to be used to help out others who are still deep in the trenches fighting their own giants. A candle loses absolutely nothing by lighting another candle. The early church demonstrated this exact same spirit. When believers suffered, others came alongside them. When some lacked basic resources, those with plenty shared generously. We live in a modern world that aggressively promotes individual success and isolated personal comfort, right? But the community of faith operates on an entirely different frequency. We literally do not become poorer by encouraging others. God's love simply shines more brightly through us.
Section 4. When God says no.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast we're looking at. We're moving into the final and perhaps the most poignant narrative of Deuteronomy 3. Moses turns his attention to his successor, Joshua. He recounts all of God's past victories over these two massive kings, Sihon and Og. Moses uses this history as a rock-solid foundation, telling Joshua, "Your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done. So will the Lord do to all the kingdoms through which you pass." Future faith grows from remembering past faithfulness. But right after this triumphant commissioning, we hit a deeply emotional wall. Look at this comparison. On the left, we have human expectation. Moses has led these people through the wilderness for 40 grueling years. He's endured their complaints, immense hardships, and just crushing leadership responsibilities. He pleads with God, "Let me cross over and see the good land." Humanly speaking, the guy deserved it. But on the right, we see divine redirection. Because of Moses' prior disobedience at Meribah, God's answer is a firm no. God tells him, "Enough of that. Speak no more to me of this matter." Moses can look at the land from the top of Pisgah, but he cannot enter. This is incredibly sobering. It shows us that even history's absolute greatest servants do not always receive the answers they deeply desire. And Moses isn't alone in this. The Apostle Paul repeatedly prayed for God to remove his thorn in the flesh, and God's answer wasn't healing, it was grace. "My grace is sufficient for you." King David passionately desired to build the temple for God, yet God assigned that privilege to his son, Solomon. Sometimes God says yes, sometimes he says wait, and sometimes, he says no. The true test of our faith isn't merely trusting God when he hands us exactly what we asked for. The true test is trusting him when he doesn't. Section 5. Trusting the unknown future. So the crucial point is, what makes Moses truly legendary in this moment isn't just his leadership. It's his remarkable response to a devastating, deeply personal no. He didn't just throw his hands up and quit. He didn't spend his final days drowning in a sea of complaints about what was unfairly kept from him. Instead, he left us a really clear blueprint. First, he actively avoided bitterness. Second, he immediately focused on what was entrusted to him right in the present moment. And third, he poured his energy into strengthening Joshua and preparing the next generation. He finished his race faithfully. When doors don't open for you, when hopes aren't realized, these are the actionable steps you can take to move forward with real purpose. Because here is the profound truth of the whole shebang. God's purposes are always, always larger than our personal desires. Moses didn't enter the physical promised land, but he became one of the greatest leaders in human history and prepared an entire nation to claim their inheritance. Sometimes God's no protects us from things we can't foresee. Sometimes it gracefully redirects us to a much better path. And sometimes it accomplishes generational purposes we simply cannot yet understand. Faith is measured by our willingness to trust that his wisdom is so much higher than our own. Deuteronomy 3 shows us that the giants, they will certainly come. Disappointments will occasionally visit our lives, but through every single valley, God remains relentlessly faithful. The same God who defeated the giant Og is fully capable of overcoming the obstacles standing in your way right now. As we close out this explainer, I want to leave you with this challenge, drawn from a truly beautiful prayer. May we surrender our plans to your perfect will, knowing that your ways are always good. Face your giants with courage, serve others with the blessings you've been given, and above all, have the faith to surrender your unknown future into his perfectly loving hands. Keep exploring, keep trusting, and we'll see you next time.